Hey everybody, it's Mr. Rowell here, and today we're going to talk a little bit about Stone Age man. Now, when we talk about Stone Age man, we're going to break it up into two different eras or periods of time. The first one here is the Paleolithic era. So, what I want you to do now is I want you to put me on pause and I want you to copy down these notes. Okay, thank you. All right, so now when we talk about the Paleolithic era, we're talking about basically the beginning of man. So we're talking about man and early hominids that came before us, who had very similar characteristics. The groups that we talked about before, like Homo erectus, Homo habilis, Neanderthal man. And then into Homo sapiens sapiens, us. Now, these groups were all hunters and gatherers, meaning that they got their food, and basically their entire purpose of life was to find that food and to kill that food to provide for themselves and their families or their groups. We'll talk about that in a little bit. They did have stone tools and bone tools that they used for hunting and for other purposes, as you could see with the images on the side. I'll put my pointer on here. Pointer's not working. Okay, no worries. Let's move on to our next slide. Okay. Now, technology during this time period is best characterized as very simple. The only point of their technology really was revolved around food. Food was everything. Now, these folks, they lived primarily in caves for protection from the shelter. Sometimes they did make simple tent-type structures as well, but most of the time lived in caves. And the groups were generally around 20 or 30 people, sometimes as much as 60 people. They were kind of like a clan almost. They were a family. They lived together and they survived, and they kind of supported one another. The idea of religion comes from this time period. As you can see in the picture on the left-hand side, we do have a deceased early man being buried, and it looks like it's a community event and they're there for one another. So it's some sort of idea of afterlife and religion. This is a time period that the famous cave sketchings were made, such as Lascaux, where we spent a good amount of time searching and working on that topic. And that was done definitely by Homo sapiens sapiens, but also it's believed to have been done in part by Neanderthal man. Now, things change in the Stone Age. Now, they're still going to use stone tools and bone tools. But during this new Stone Age, the Neolithic era, about 8,000 to 3,000 BCE, the numbers I've seen as high as 9,000 to 3,500, but let's just use round numbers, 8 to 3,000 BCE. This is when folks began to settle down. This is because of agriculture. Man begins to realize, food, it's coming out of the ground here, same spot every year. Maybe we can do something with this and kind of control it. Now, this wasn't done overnight. This was, collective learning at its best, generation after generation improving upon this. But eventually, they began to grow enough food that they could store their food and that they could feed one another, that they didn't have to rely on going out and finding food every day. This was a major change. This is called the rise of agriculture. Now, because of this rise of agriculture, you're going to have several different settlements develop. These are basically going to be towns, and people are going to begin to develop in places such as Jericho, Çatalhöyük, which is up here, okay, and then we have Jarmo down here. Now, this is all going to be in an area called the Fertile Crescent. And as you guys know from science class, crescent shape, like the crescent moon, is kind of like a quarter circle. And this represents an area that becomes known as Mesopotamia, which goes from the Persian Gulf up into what's now Iraq and down into what's now Israel, down towards the Mediterranean Sea. Okay, this is called the Fertile Crescent because it's fertile land in the middle of very arid land, and it's best represented or best described as the land between the rivers, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and then along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea and the Persian Gulf. During this time period, people began to develop simple recipes for cooking, and they develop pottery so they could store their food, so they could transport their food, so they can maintain their food. Civilization is beginning to develop during this time period. Now, also during this time, culture becomes much more complex. It's no longer just trying to find food. It's now about the farmers having the specific job of growing the food. It's about traders developing trade networks to trade one good from one area to another area and get goods that they don't have in their own area to bring back. Also, this is before the advent of money, so a barter system, trade. I give you, for example, I would say this in the lunchroom. I'll give you my fries if you give me some of your pizza. Barter system. It's the basic elements of an economy. Now, the communities begin to increase in size during this time. So now we're talking 200 to 300 people. We're not talking about tents and caves anymore. We're talking about permanent structures. We're talking about skilled people creating beautiful tools, creating beautiful pottery. We have the wheel coming about during this time, the sail, the plow. So this helps trade, this helps farming. Things are really developing during this time period. And these sort of changes are going to become the building blocks of civilization. Now, this was a quick little overview. But I hope that you find it very useful, and it will help us prepare as we move on to talk about our first culture called Sumeria.